Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Learning Enhancement Education webinar series on the cognitive skills for essential language learners. I'm very excited to have all of you join us today, and I hope that your day is as beautiful as ours. We want to try and keep on time, so there's a couple things that you will notice when you come in the room. You will be on mute when you join the session, and we will keep them muted until we open the phones for questions at the end. My name is Dr. Sarah Sattel. I am the Director of Scientific Affairs for Learning Enhancement Corporation, and I'm very happy to join you guys today. And I also have with me our President and COO, Betsy Hill, who's also a former foreign language teacher who's going to be participating as a panelist with us. And then we also have joining our panelists a couple special guests that we'll introduce fully a little bit later, Peggy Harrington and Anna Gomez, and they will be joining us toward the end of the session. I do want to let all of you know that we are recording this session so that it will be posted up on our education website a little bit later, probably in about a week, and we hope to be able to convey the right information for you today so that you will get exactly what you're looking for. Our agenda today is really pretty simple. We're going to keep it about language in the brain. We're going to start out talking a little bit about how that works, and then talk about how we do language acquisition, both initially and when we're talking about second language acquisition. And we're going to focus on the role of cognitive skills about that. And then at the end, we're going to talk about the Hammond Schools Hammond, Indiana, their bilingual program, and the successes that they've had and some things that they've done to really address the cognitive skills of their classrooms. So we're going to get started, and I get to talk a little bit first about getting us all on the same page about our brains and how we use them. Now, this isn't going to be a very extensive piece. We just want to make sure that as we're talking about the language pathways, that we all have some sense of where we're going and what we're talking about. So we have an image of the brain here that's very simplified, but it is necessary so that you can see the parts of the brain that are working as we're speaking. And what we have here is the eyes are facing to the left, so the eyes are over to the lobe there between the purple and the yellow that you see. And what we have is the left hemisphere of our brain that we're looking at. And what we're focusing on are the neocortex. And so we're first going to talk about, here you're seeing the occipital lobe. This is that pink portion in the back of the brain. It is our primary visual area. It's known as the visual cortex. And you can think of its location as being the eyes in the back of your head. Your vision-related things and visualization happen in the back of your head, not in the front of your head. The next one that we want to talk about is the parietal lobe, and that in this diagram is that light blue piece, and that gives you a sense of spatial awareness. It's where your body map is found. It really controls your sense of your own self and your sense of your own body. And so you can help think about where that particular area is in your brain. As you think about it, it's very aptly located at the top of your head so that it has a view of everything below it. So it looks down and focuses everything around it. The third piece that we want to talk about, we're going to talk about quite a lot today, and that's the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe is this purple section that looks like an ear that you see there on your diagram. And that is the area where we understand language, where we recognize objects. It is where we have our, we're going to hear a lot about it as it's associated with our language recognition. And the way that you can remember that is it kind of looks like an ear when you sit and look at this, and that's exactly where it is on your own brains. It's right above your ears. That's where your temporal lobe is located. And then the last part of our four lobes of our neocortex is our frontal lobe. And this is where higher cognitive functioning happens. It's executive functioning, our decision making, Really, it's known as the stop and think center. It's the last part of our brains to develop. And one way that I remember where it's located and what it does is I think about Winnie the Pooh. And when Winnie the Pooh had a problem he was trying to figure out, and he'd sit down and he'd tap his head and think, he was actually tapping his frontal lobe and saying, think, think, think. So that's a nice way to remember what your frontal lobe does and where it's located. So just keeping that simplistic idea of where those parts are, remember it's all integrated and they all work together with all of our functioning. And one way we can show this is to look at actual scans of brains while they're doing things. And that's what you're seeing here. These are fMRIs, and that technique is a brain imaging technique that lets us see the areas that are active when the brain is doing something. And so what you see here in the upper left is what the brain looks like when you're passively viewing words, like you are right now. And what you see is that the hot areas are the lighter colors. So you see the bright red and the orange and the yellow, and that's all happening in the back of your head, where your eyes in the back of your head are, where your occipital lobe is. If you move to the right, you see we have a brain that is listening to words, something else that your brain is doing right now. And you can see that it's very active. And these brains are all facing to the left, so you're looking at the left hemisphere. And you can see that it's very active through the temporal lobe, part of the parietal lobe, part of the occipital lobe. You can see all that activity there. Then if we move to the bottom left and you look at the brain that is speaking words, you can see that the most activity is happening right around the ridge where the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe are connected. You can see all of that activity. And then the fourth brain to look at is one generating verbs. So you can see that there's a couple hot spots that are happening both in the back of the head and in the front of the head. So that gives you an idea of everything that's going on as you are using your brains. So now, the next thing we want to do is we want to get focused in on what's happening when we are doing the active language and look at the language pathway. And before we focus on second language learners, let's take a look at what the language pathway actually looks like for the primary language, when we're first learning language. And you see here, again, this is a brain that is facing to the left, and you can see the white line is what's known as the language pathway. And the reason we have it facing to the left is because in most humans, 97% of humans, the major language function is happening along that white pathway there, and it's happening on the left hemisphere. And you can see it starts at the back of the arrow and goes toward the arrow point. So it's starting back in the occipital lobe, and it's moving toward the frontal lobe. There are a couple places that I want to point out in this, and at the same time, I want to bring up that fMRI that shows what happens when you are generating words. So you can see the similarity between that image and our drawing representation. And when you're looking at the language pathway, I only want to point out a couple areas here. And the first one is the orange area, and it's known as Wernicke's area, or for those of us that aren't English, it is a German word, and often you'll hear it called Wernicke's. Either way, this area is in the temporal lobe, and it's where our brains store our lexicon. It's where our words and objects are associated with each other. And that often is associated with knowing the meaning of things. So if it's an area that's damaged in a stroke or something like that, and someone's having problems connecting a word to an object, it's usually damage in that area. The other thing to point out is in the frontal lobe, the green area, known as Broca's area. And Broca's area is where we produce our syntax, where we actually process the language. And when people have problems in this area, it is evident with a halting speech or a disordered syntax. Now, one thing we do know is that in dual languages, they often use the right hemisphere, not the left hemisphere, or a combination of the two. There are some other things that we've learned in some recent research about language and how things are processed. And one is that when the pathway that we've given you is pretty simplified, and it turns out, as with most brain functions, there are areas scattered throughout the brain that are involved when you're doing something, and in this case, speech production. And most of those areas are scattered throughout the left hemisphere, as you can see in that fMRI there to the right. We have a place that nouns are processed separately from verbs, and they show evidence of that in fMRI scans. We also process emotional content differently. Many times the emotional content is processed not on a higher order thinking scale, but more at our inner brain and in our amygdala. And then finally, when we're talking about complex speech, we often use more and more areas in order to do complex speech because it requires more work and we start using other parts of our brain. And we activate other areas, including those in the right hemisphere. So it's a simplified pathway, and most of the activity is where you're showing. But you can see that there's, by that fMRI, that there's other areas that are lit up. Now, the last thing we want to focus in now is as we're talking about second languages in the brain. And there have been some fMRIs relatively recently of students who have learned a second language when they were very young versus those that learned at a later time. And some interesting things resulted from that study. One thing is we learned that when you're looking at Wernicke's area in the back, you see no difference in the areas of activity between using languages for either group when they're using two languages. They both use that area, and they use it about the same way. There's no differences. But at Broca's area, for later learners, there's definitely a difference. And there's a difference in how Broca's area is used for the later learners versus the younger learners. So there's lots of new things that are coming out about how we do second language. So I'm going to turn it over to Betsy.
Great. Thank you very much, Sarah. One thing I do want to say for all of those who are madly trying to scribble down what you're seeing on the PowerPoint slides is that we will be providing a copy of the slides for you and sending it out following the webinar. So hopefully that will make things a little bit easier for you. So now we want to shift basically from where language happens in the brain to how it gets there at all. And as Sarah's discussion suggests, our brains really are wired for language. We are wired to learn it at a very young age, with all of the basic language functions really being in place by about age 3. Of course, there are a lot of individual differences in the timing, but it is pretty universally true that we learn our first language without a lot of correction, without a lot of direct instruction. It's almost like we just absorb it from the environment around us. And in fact, even in communities where there is not spoken language, or it's very limited, language arises. And you've heard stories, I'm sure, about twins who create their own languages to be able to communicate to each other. It's also true that in communities of deaf people that sign language arises spontaneously. So one of the things to look at in terms of this timeline is that the sound aspects of language are being sorted out from our earliest interactions with the environment. But that meaning and grammar don't take very much longer than that. So you can switch to the next slide. For most of us, unless we are learning two languages simultaneously, the job of learning that second language, and that's true of the case of many English language learners, becomes much harder. Anyone who has ever listened to Henry Kissinger or other adult foreign speakers of English know all aspects of language are not equally impacted by these differences. And a lot of that has to do with our brains and our development. Learning a second language later generally puts it as a huge disadvantage with respect to pronunciation. Learning grammar is somewhat easier the first time around, but a lot of that and how much it's easier will actually depend on the languages in question. And then vocabulary, there's only really a slight advantage from learning it earlier. So we want to take a little look at each of these in turn and talk a little bit about what's happening to give us some perspective then on what we're faced with in helping English language learners. So first is pronunciation. I know many parents who have suspected all along that babies are actually listening in on their conversations even before they are born. And there is mounting evidence that that is, in fact, the case. And what they are especially attuned to when they're still in the womb is the prosody, the sound, the intonation of language. There's recent research that actually recorded a lot of cries of French and German babies. And what they found in that research is the cries of French babies tend to rise at the end, and the cries of German babies tend to go down at the end. And in fact, that matches the commonest prosody, the commonest musicality of those languages. So in fact, it gets incorporated pretty early. At birth, any baby can hear, assuming they're not deaf, can hear the sounds of all of the languages in the world. And I read somewhere recently that that's about 150 phonemes. And it's actually been shown that infants can distinguish between different sounds that in our language don't have a phonemic difference. By about 6 months, however, babies have mastered the phonemes of the language or languages into which they are born that are in the environment. So that doesn't mean that it is impossible to learn it later, but what happens is that the phonemes, the ability to perceive the phonemes of other languages actually withers away. We sort of become deaf to them. And we can understand why this would be because it is so important given how much we depend on language and communication to be able to quickly distinguish the sounds of our language and of meaningful speech from all of the other background noise. So it's not that it's impossible later, but it does become significantly more difficult. And most people believe that by mid-adolescence, it is the time when it really, really becomes difficult. Moving on to grammar and syntax, one of the things that you saw on that chart before is that children's speech is generally very grammatical by the age of 3 or 4. The estimates are about 90% grammatical, and that most mistakes that are made, most grammar and syntax mistakes, are over-regularization. So, for example, children will tend to make mistakes like mouse and mouses, using mouses as the plural for mouse instead of mice because mice is irregular. So what they have learned and come to be automatic is the addition of the S after a plural, or the past tense of verbs, so that you will hear children say, I am holding the cat, and yesterday I holded the cat instead of I held the cat. So learning grammar later can be tricky, but the difficulty really depends on how different the second language is from the first. And there are some aspects of language, for example, that are really universal. So these don't need to be relearned. They are there. There are nouns and verbs, it turns out, in all languages, and therefore our brains manage to categorize words in a new language as nouns or verbs the same way that they do when we're learning our initial language. But there are other aspects of grammar that can be different, and if they are rare and occur only in a few languages, they're likely to be difficult, of course, for most people because they require a different mental structure. Word order is a good example of that. So when you see SVO strings, that refers to subject, verb, object. And here's some examples and some comparisons that sort of to highlight on this next slide the differences among some languages and why some might be more difficult than others. So for example, back a million years ago when I was in college and learning French and Russian. Actually, I started learning French when I was in 7th grade, but back at that time, when I was trying to acquire that, I didn't have to worry about the order of words and understanding that the subject came first and the verb came second and the object came third. So I would say, in English, I see the train. In French, je vois le train. And the order was the same. It wasn't something that I even had to think about. However, if I were now to start working on Japanese, I would have a little bit harder because the word order, the standard syntax in Japanese is subject, then the object, and then the verb. This used to be an acceptable order in English, and we have maintained it in some archaic expressions like with this ring, I thee wed. So I thee wed is subject-object verb instead of I wed you. Although that's certainly how we would say it if we were just talking normally and not in the middle of a marriage ceremony. And then, of course, there are actually some where the verb comes first, and then there are those languages that become particularly difficult for speakers of languages that actually insist on word order to define syntax and the relationships among the concepts in the words. And anyone who has studied Latin, who has studied French, Russian, as I did, and then speakers of Finnish, I know that it is extremely challenging for us because it is not the order of the words in the sentence that defines their meaning, but actually prefixes and usually suffixes, which are called the inflection of the word, that actually defines their role in the sentence. So to take the example that I have here, and the famous headline, which dog bites man, is not a very startling headline, but man bites dog will certainly be. And what you can see here is in Latin, very different ways of being able to say the same thing. Canis is the word for dog, mordet is the word for bite, and hominem is the object form of the word man. So when it's a subject, it wouldn't have that M-E-M ending. It would actually just be homo, H-O-M-O. But it doesn't matter what order you put them on in terms, as long as that ending is correct. So I can put them in the order man bites or dog bites man, or I can actually reverse that order. As long as those endings are right, it still means dog bites man. But if I change those endings, I'll turn it into man bites dog. All right, and finally, getting to vocabulary. Remember we said that vocabulary, we don't have that huge an advantage learning it early versus late. And that's because our brains are really designed to continue to develop vocabulary and to name concepts. We learn vocabulary throughout our lives. When I was back in college, I didn't know the terms email, blog, and laptop. They're part of my everyday language, of course, today. We know that new words continue to enter our language. They are maybe colloquial, they may be slang. Many of them eventually make it into the dictionary. And then also consider all of the specialized terminology that we learn with whatever profession we enter into. So terms like SPED, Special Education, ELL, English Language Learners, Title I, RTI, all of these words I also didn't know back when I was in college, and many of you may not have either. But we get to know them as we become familiar with them. So our brains, it's important for us as humans to be able to learn new vocabulary throughout our lives. So what we want to do now is move on to the connection of cognitive skills. Remember, we said that there are a number of parts of the brain that get involved with language, and now we want to take a look at some of those. Not all issues of learning a language are specifically language issues, and what the research is starting to do is to illuminate how some fundamental functions of the brain impact how quickly and effectively we learn a language, both first languages and later language acquisition. And this will turn out to be very important for those ELL students we'll get to talking about very soon. So this is a little bit of a model of how the brain processes information. We won't go into a lot of depth, but basically what it shows is that we take in information through our senses, where the reception processes are on the left-hand side of the model. Then we have to give that information or that data some meaning. Those are the perception processes. Then we get to consciously manipulate that information. That's what we refer to on this chart as thinking. And all of these depend on our memory process. And what I want to do today is to focus on 4 specific cognitive processes. We also refer to them as cognitive skills. And these are selective attention, sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory. So first we'll take a look at sensory memory. This is a skill that we have to use in decoding phonemes. So for example, if we hear the sounds d, g, They come into our ears. We sort them out in our brain and match it up against what we have stored in our memory banks. And if we can make sense of it, we might come up with an image like the little one in the bottom right-hand corner of that little puppy dog, that nice little furry creature, and we might even think about the fact that he might bite the man, but the man probably wouldn't bite him. So if we can't make sense of it, however, what we will do is we'll direct our attention back to that sensory memory trace. And that sensory memory is where the trace of the sensory data exists in our brains, and we maintain it really only for short periods of time. But if it's working effectively, we can actually go back and consult it and try to make sense of it again. So the effectiveness of our sensory memory can, in fact, impact our language ability, especially when we have to take time and we might not recognize the word instantaneously. We have to go back and check that sensory memory trace. Now let's shift to selective attention. This is another example. And remember that these examples that we're looking are not the only skills we use, but I think it really helps to make the connection between how our various skills in our mental facility actually impact language. So I'm going to ask you now to everybody look at that picture of the object on the upper right-hand portion of the slide. If you speak more than one language, or maybe even if you don't, your store of information in your lexicon in Wernicke's area might suggest a variety of words, of candidates that you might use to express that concept. So our ability to actually focus our choice and to choose the relevant choice and to screen out all the other candidates here, and what you see if we're talking about Spanish and English speakers and the target language, the language that they're trying to express themselves in is Spanish, they might have to suppress or select out the words silla and asiento, as well as the English word seat. And there might be other things depending on what the languages are they're speaking. The last example, or the third example that I want to talk a little bit about is the use of long-term memory. This is also looking at those grammar rules that we learned by the time we were 3 and 4, where we had to learn the exceptions. So, for example, when we were 3 and 4 years old, we learned how to add ed for the past tense in English, and we learned not to say goed as the past tense of go. And that information has to be stored in long-term memory as a separate vocabulary word. So to get that word into long-term memory and to get it to be automatic as part of long-term memory, it's actually an aspect of memory that's called procedural memory. Procedural memory gets to be a strong memory and to get to be automatic by lots and lots and lots of practice. So the way that you learned how to walk was a lot of practice and trial and error. The way you learned to tie your shoes was a lot of that. The way you learned how to ride a bike, all those kinds of things. And the things that we do over and over again and repeat get to be stored in our procedural memory, our long-term memory. So that's exactly what we've done. And in fact, the research supports that and show that speakers who have a lot of experience with irregular verbs produce it very easily, and they will generally come up with went much more quickly than the word go, whereas those who have not had a lot of practice are more likely to apply the standard rule for the past tense. The last cognitive skill I want to talk about today is working memory, and specifically its role in comprehension. We can think of working memory as our mental workspace, where we hold a bunch of information while we're manipulating it. We use working memory really in just about everything we do, but it becomes really important when we have to hold information in our minds as learners of a second language, especially when we're searching for vocabulary and other information that isn't yet automatic. And of course, the more complex our language gets, the more we use it. So consider my example here. John, who was made fun of by the girl who was kissed by the chimpanzee, came to visit my grandmother yesterday. So what we're having to do is to hold on to the concept of John and all the description about the girl and the chimpanzee kissing the girl and all of that until we get to the end of the sentence. that is all stuff that we're holding in working memory until we resolve it at the end and learn that John actually visited our grandmother yesterday. Now, consider the possibility that you're learning this language, you can't remember what the words kissed and chimpanzee mean, and you'll start to appreciate how much more complex trying to hold these concepts and figure out how they relate to each other. And now imagine that you're now listening to an inflected language where word order permits the by the chimpanzee kissed girl John made fun of, my grandmother yesterday visited.
Okay, that one hurts my head.
Yeah, well, actually, I tried to imagine how I could actually say that in Russian, and I think it works. So, in any event, what I'm trying to get at here is the importance of working memory for thinking and language learning, especially when we're learning a language where we have to be able to search for vocabulary, keep lots of ideas in mind. This, of course, begs the question of whether and how we can actually improve those cognitive skills and improve the ability to learn language. But before we get to that, what I want to do is share just a little bit more information that we're learning about bilingualism. So before we really started to understand all these things that are going on in our brains, or had tested some of these hypotheses, and in fact, back when I was teaching language, there was a lot of uncertainty about this. But there were a lot of myths about bilingualism and whether it was good or whether it was bad. But everything on this page is a myth. Our brains, in fact, can handle multiple languages. And as we saw before, we don't have to relearn all the skills. Whether or not we do just depends on the similarities and the differences between the languages. So we're not necessarily learning them. Languages are in the same parts of the brain sometimes, but basically we're using a lot of parts of our brain, especially when it's complex language, and that doesn't change whether it's one or two. Now, not only are there not these disadvantages to bilingualism and to dual language speaking or multiple language speaking, there actually are cognitive benefits of bilingualism, and the research is really showing this, and it's so exciting to me. The ability to form concepts, classification skills, reasoning, visual, spatial, all of these skills, including things like creativity, are in fact improved by learning a second language, and that's generally true whether it's balanced bilingualism from very young age or even learning a language at a later age. So one of the important concepts here is that, and the conclusions that we can draw, is that cognitive skills both are essential to acquire language, but also learning a language can actually improve those skills. So it turns out that there are some ways, and we'll be talking about them in a minute, that we can actually boost cognitive skills to accelerate language acquisition. But then what happens is that you can really accelerate this whole wonderful virtuous circle where improving cognitive skills leads to stronger learning of a language, which leads to improved cognitive skills, et cetera, et cetera. So now what we'd like to do is to focus in a little bit on our English learning population, which is, of course, very large and growing. Estimates are it's 5 million English learners in the United States, and that's a few years ago. We know it's growing very dramatically, at a much higher rate than the general pre-kindergarten to 12th grade population. In many states, it accounts for a very significant. I know we have a lot of folks on who have signed up for the webinar, at least, from Texas, but it's many southwestern states. Illinois, Florida have very high rates of EL students. It's growing very fast in the southeast. It's also complicated because many of them are living in poverty. They come from low socioeconomic status families. And it's not, we often think of Spanish, but we know that there are actually hundreds of languages that are involved here. So it's not a simple thing. The other thing that we know, and I think it's just helpful to have this in our minds as we start to talk about the experience in Hammond, Indiana, is that the academic achievement of English language learners significantly lags non-ELL learners. It starts already and is quite apparent in both reading and math by the testing that's done in 4th grade. This is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. but persists and, in fact, seems to even the gap seems to grow wider by the time we get to 8th grade. So these are obviously really major issues that we're dealing with, a growing population that really needs some ways of addressing these issues that perhaps haven't existed before. So what I'd like to do now is to introduce some folks who can tell us about a very effective program and talk about the role of cognitive skill development in helping ELL students. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to introduce Peggy Harrington, Director of the Hammond, Indiana Bilingual Program, and Ana Gomez, who is a coach in the Bilingual Program. Peggy has been Director of the program since 1991. She believes fervently in providing students with teachers who are really well trained in the best language acquisition methodologies. She believes in well-prepared lesson plans based on the state standards. Her program is all about respect of diversity of cultures, inclusion of parents in all aspects of the program, and partnering with the local community. She has served both in Chicago and Northwest Indiana as an educator and administrator for limited English proficiency students for more than 30 years, although if you saw her, you would conclude from that she started at the age of 1. And she was involved in a major grant that helped create the bilingual education program in Hammond. She is joined by Ana Gomez, who is the coach in the program and who was responsible for the implementation, the addition of the cognitive skills program in the district's pilot, which we're going to share with you. She also has extensive teaching experience with ESL and has been very much involved in many of the projects within the Hammond Bilingual Program. So, no further ado, I would like to turn it over to Peggy and Ana.
Good afternoon. We are both very delighted to be here today and to discuss our program and this wonderful added dimension. We are a program that's been here for many years. We started the program here in Hammond with only 2 schools and have advanced to 20, in fact, all 23 schools. We have more than 1,600 students who have come from 64 different language groups. We have exotic languages such as Igbo and Urdu, but our primary language is, of course, Spanish. We do all the necessary procedures and processes as required by the state and federal government. We assess our children both in language acquisition as well as the other skills, the cognitive skills and the other state-required testing. We focus on English language acquisition, although in some of our models we do all areas, all content areas. We know that if our students are going to be good citizens, they have to also be properly acculturated, so we focus on that along with their parents. We do cultural diversity training for all our mainstream people in all our buildings. And we serve as a resource for all those mainstream staff as they are faced with more and more incoming students. One real support that's requested on a daily basis is translation and interpretation for families, and we do that as well. And then as many of you who are experiencing a large influx, you probably have a lot of students who come in without any literacy foundation. And that's been another focus for us. And as we implement, and I know that Ana will speak to that, as we implemented and incorporated the program from our Brainware program, that has been very, very impactful with our students that have that background of non-literacy in either language. So that pretty much, I guess, defines what we do, the basis for what we do. But as a result of our really comprehensive program, we've made AYP. The AYP parameters have been established by the federal government. We've made that since 2005. We received some state awards based on our creativity and innovation with English language proficiency standards. And I'll speak to that a little bit more in a moment. We do all our lesson planning electronically. And of course, we've been recognized for that. And I think most important, our priority has always been students. And we've been able to reduce the amount of time that our children go through the language acquisition process to about 2.5 years from the 5 to 7 year average. And I think that's really due to the comprehensive model that we introduced to our students. We utilize multiple models in our district, and that's because we, even though we're only 23 schools, we have a wide spectrum of needs throughout the district. And in some buildings where we have higher concentration sites, we do a sheltered English model. We do push in and pull out as our kids advance in language acquisition. We do a comprehensive summer school, which, by the way, we're in our second day, and I pulled away from that hectic summer school to speak to you. And all our instruction is computer-based. We use smart boards and large screens for all our instruction, and that's initiated from our electronic lesson plans. So having said all that, and having done this, she's mentioned for more than 30 years and more than 20 years here in Hammond, we knew that our traditional models are working, but we needed to take it to a different level. One of the things we noticed is that even though our kids were learning to speak language, the English language a lot faster, and we were becoming acculturated, we wanted to step up their higher cognitive skill development. So Anna and I attended a workshop, and we're so impressed with what we heard, and some of it you've heard today, that we were delighted to come back and pilot this model here at our district, and we've had just wonderful results, and it's truly given us another dimension to what we do, and it's taken us beyond that traditional model or the traditional models that most school districts, as well as what I've done over the years, have implemented. So it is with delight that I introduce you to Anna, because she's the one who did all the grunt work to get it really going, and I guess Anna really does understand the language acquisition process even more than I. She grew up as a bilingual student, an ESL bilingual student in a program that I implemented about 20 miles from here, and she's a gifted instructor, knows that the process of learning another language can be very, very difficult. For any of you who translate, you probably know that if you do that for an hour, it can be as exhausting as cleaning your house for 8 hours. It really does take a drain on your brain, and brainware is a refreshing where kids really don't know that they're making such an effort to use their brains, but it exercises their brains so much that it really readies them for more language acquisition. So having said that, I'm going to turn you over to Ana Gomez, and she's going to go ahead and talk about the process.
Hello. I'm Ana Gomez, and I'll just quickly introduce myself or add a little bit more. I began here in the Bilingual Education Program in 1998, and the program, as Ms. Harrington said, kept growing. And I taught at about 7 different schools already in Hammond. Pull-out bilingual model and sheltered English model. And for the last couple of years, I've been coaching staff and doing whatever needs to get done to keep our program running smoothly. I'm going to explain what we did with how we used brainware. basically we began by setting up a timeline, and as the slides show, we selected 8 weeks towards the end of the school year, and I worked with the teachers to use 30 minutes of their language arts block time instruction. So everybody was in agreement with how the brainware was going to run, and teachers helped me out by making sure the students showed up on time and everything flowed together. So we had 39 students, 39 bilingual students. Most of them were non-English proficient, but we also had LEPs in the mix. And my role was primarily to gather the data, to create the schedules. I had gathered data such as pre-SRI data, which, the Scholastic Reading Inventory Lexile scores. I had Lexile scores for all the students that participated in the study. It was my job to keep monitoring the students' progress, and I also set up post-data assessments for SRI. So not only did I monitor their progress, I monitored their activity in brainware, and I also went up to students daily, and I would say things like, oh, I noticed you haven't tried out this activity or that activity. So I let them know that, I was aware of what they were doing, so that students were selecting all the activities versus just their favorite ones. I also checked on the student attendance. I would, if the students were gone, I would try to, let them know, try to be here every day. So little things like that. But once everything was going in the classroom, we all began together. Instead of, one student, everybody started together. They logged in together. I had a timer on the smart board, or if you don't have a smart board, just a regular timer, and I would tell the students, when I say begin, select your activity. I let the students know that they had 30 minutes of brainware to complete, but we were going to do it 10 minutes at a time. So once the first timer went off, the first session, the students had to stop, even though some of them didn't want to because they were so into the activity. They had to stop. I walked around. I made sure that everybody exited that activity, and then we began the second 10-minute session. They stopped, and then we did the third 10-minute session. So they had to select different ones. And I made sure I gave them the directions, from the very beginning, and I repeated it as necessary. The directions were very explicit, yet simple. And, I basically was there for encouragement and making sure that everything was working properly. We had no trouble implementing this. We will be I know this happened on the middle school, high school level, but we are also starting it soon with our elementary school sites, and I know most schools are on their, they have those reading blocks. It can be a station. So we're going to select students for 8 weeks, and those students will go to that station until they've completed the appropriate, amount of time that they need to put into brainware. And then and I'm saying that just to give you ideas if you're at an elementary school. And that basically was my role involved, and and I was in charge of submitting the rosters and passing out the passwords. But it's not difficult to implement, not at all.
Well, thank you, Anna. We will we'll see if we have some more questions. Many of you may not have yet experienced what brainware is all about, and we don't have the time. We want to stay true on our timeline, so we won't be showing you the program today, but you can sign up for a webinar on our website, or you can contact Betsy or I after the webinar, and we can get you connected to get a web demo so you can see the power of the program for yourself. We do want to show you a few of the results that they got from Hammond, and then we can go back and get some more questions from Anna if we have some time. So before we move on, what I want to tell you is we looked at two things with this group of students. They did such a great job with implementing this on such a short timeline. And so we had a cognitive piece where it was a behavioral rating scale that the teachers took and did for each of the students. And they were asked questions about specific growth parameters. And it was things about completing work and following directions and ability to visualize, things that are outcomes of our cognitive abilities that are easily observed in the classroom and how they changed. And then the other thing we did was we looked at those SRI Lexile scores. So what we found out from the teachers was that all of them noted improvements in all 14 of those behaviors. But we had 4 top areas that were repeatedly noted, and that was the desire to perform or put in effort, their ability to have a longer attention span and to be able to focus longer, how well they started following directions, and one that's really crucial for our ability to learn another language. All of these are, but particularly the ability to visualize. Increases in that was also noted by those teachers. So that was really exciting just to see how the teachers saw the changes. But then we looked at the data too. And what I want to show you is really it's from the Scholastic Reading Inventory. And in one school year, that inventory, the benchmarks, are expecting 250 Lexile points of growth in one school year. And it's benchmarked for at-risk, basic, proficient, and advanced levels of performance. And one thing I learned as part of this pilot was that this test, which is a common test used in schools, is very hard for these students because there's no visual clues. It's all very text-based, and so it's even harder for these students to perform on this test, and yet this test is used to be able to place them into appropriate places in the school. So it's kind of a catch-22 for these students. So what we saw was we were looking at the benchmark that was taken at the second trimester before they used brainware. And I just want to focus in on a couple things here and get you to ignore the rest of the graph. But look at the yellowish bar, and it's by grade, so 6th grade, 7th grade, and the 8th graders and the 9th grader I lumped together. And you can see their average score, the SRI Lexile score, for each grade. And you can see the yellow bar. That's what you're seeing there. And that yellow line is what the slope is for those students. And when you look at the brown line, that is where the basic proficiency rating is for the SRI score. And then you see the orange is proficient. You can see how far they are from proficient and how they aren't, how they're just barely at basic in 6th grade and 8th grade. And the other thing to notice is that yellow line, if you look at it, you can see how it starts to tip toward the brown line instead of being on the same slope or at a better slope than that brown basic line. So they're losing ground is what it looks like as they get older. So what we did then is we looked at, they did brainware, and one thing, because this was right at the end of the school year, the SRI test that Anna gave them for their post was right at the end of the school year, the worst time in the world to test students, but we needed them to be in brainware as long as possible, and they were also still doing brainware at the same time. So keep that in mind. They're doing a cognitive skill development program. It's not a program that is language-based at all, but developing those underlying processes that Betsy was talking about. And what we got were the results like this. Same setup. And you can see the average score, that's the yellow bar. And the big thing to note here is the slope of that yellow line. You can see that it's starting to change, and those 8th and 9th graders are now catching up. The 7th graders, everybody increased their scores. And you can see the average increase for every grade. And they're getting closer to that proficient mark. And that was right while they were finishing brainware. Now, the other thing we looked at real quickly is we looked at the number of students, or the percentage of students overall in those 3 grades, that those 39 students, that increased their score from the first trimester to the second trimester. That's the way you want them to go, but we all know that half the time, or sometimes more than half the time, the students decrease at the mid-year benchmark instead of decrease, whether they're ELL or regular students. And then to also then compare and see how that changed when they took it at the third, comparing it between the third trimester and the second trimester score, when they took it at the very end of the year, when most of the time it's very hard to get them to focus on a test. So what you see is the orange bar is the percentage of students that increased, and the first group is between second trimester and first trimester. And you can see we only had 40% of the students increase their score when they took it at the second trimester. When you compare that to the third trimester, we had 65% increase their score. So there definitely was some positive changes that we saw even on that quick of a timeline. And I'm going to, for time, not go into the different percentages, and we broke it down by grade, but one thing to note is in the 8th and 9th grade, 100% of them increased their score in the third trimester versus 33% in the second trimester. So that's a pretty significant increase. Now, the teachers had lots of good comments about the program, about using brainware with their students, how they noticed improvements academically, and I'm going to go ahead and ask Anna if she has anything else she'd like to add about what the teachers and the feeling that you guys had about using brainware with your students.
Hi. I would like to say that at the beginning I was a bit skeptical because we did have some students that had, dual issues, linguistic and special needs issues, and I was a little worried about them. I had some students in the mix that were a little on the hyper side. I worried about them too, but once we began, I was really impressed with how focused they were and how even they would ask each other, oh, where are you, or, how are you doing? They really all wanted to do well. They became even a little competitive, even though I told them their levels can be, private, but they wanted to really just work hard at it. It was really impressive to see that. Also,
well, there was one comment I wanted Anna to share, and that was on the high ability students.
Oh, yes. I noticed that one thing that I was able to notice is that there were some students that maybe they weren't making the grades in the classrooms, but with the brainware, we were able to confirm our suspicions, and some of them had really high abilities. And those students did very, very well. So some of the first ones to finish all the levels were some of our top performing students, but really high ability students. It's really going to shock you on how how the students progress and how high some of the or how many levels they actually go through. And we as a crew of teachers, all our teachers also tried brainware too, so we got to see that it's not easy and it's challenging, and it's you literally feel your brain working, exercising.
That's great. That is wonderful. Betsy, are you still on the line?
I'm on the line. Do we have just a couple of minutes for questions? I think what we'd like to do now, just take a couple minutes. I know we're right up against our deadline, but there might be some questions. Either type them in your chat window or click on the little hand symbol, and that will indicate that you have a question. And if you do, Sarah will be happy to unmute you so that you can ask your question.
We do have a question about using it with congenitally deaf children.
Well, there are parts of, I guess if they are profoundly deaf, the program is not appropriate for them. If they can hear some or can hear with assistance, there are some ways to adapt the program. So that would be something that we could, if there's specific issues around that, we'd be happy to discuss that further and see whether it would make any sense.
We also have a question about the results being significantly significant and which rating scale was used, and I'll address that one. This was just one group of students. We did not have a control group. We just looked at pure case study, what changes did we see with these students. So there is lots of work to be done with this particular group of students, looking at how changing their cognitive skills can be effective on ELL with a pure research-oriented focus with control and study, but we don't yet have that information. And the rating scale is one...
I'm sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
The rating scale is one that we have derived that are skills that we have heard that people see changes in. And so it's one that is about the kinds of skills, that behaviors that are an outcome of the skills.
Those are also, well, we did not do a statistical or administration of a cognitive test in this particular pilot. We have done that in previous work, and the kinds of changes that we talk about here that are observed by the teachers are consistent with reports in studies where we actually did measure with things like the Woodcock-Johnson cognitive battery or the COGAT. So if you would like more information on those kinds of studies and their statistical value, we could certainly be happy to discuss that further.
Exactly. And then we also have one about, is there a plan to implement brainware in lower grades, and why was the bilingual population the focus for the pilot program?
That's one for you, Peggy.
Oh, well, I think Anna did mention that we are looking at, starting in the fall, addressing this or implementing brainware with our elementary sites. And what was the other question?
Why the bilingual?
Why bilingual?
I think because Anna and I attended the workshop, and that is essentially what we do. I don't do other responsibilities beyond bilingual because it is pretty much a massive job here in our district. So that's why it was the focus. We were just fortunate enough to attend the workshop and to be able to work with brainware.
There are ongoing discussions, and in fact, Hammond is the only pilot so far focusing on ELL students. Most of the other implementations that we've been involved with and the other conversations we're having with Hammond and other places are around a variety of general populations, and the program has been used with the general student population, the Title I population, gifted, kids who are struggling, really a variety of different kinds of approaches, because basically the cognitive processes that are involved in learning and the capacity to learn are pretty much the same for everybody.
And by the way, I think we are going to be, 2 or 3 of our schools are implementing the program for the general ed students based upon what the results they've seen with ours.
And I think one more question, and it's one that just popped up that I think maybe we need to address for those that aren't familiar with brainware. Brainware is usable with any child, any type of child, not just ELL. It's certainly beneficial with ELL, but we have used it from ages 6 and up. Betsy likes to say 6 to 106. And go ahead and ask her why not 107. And then it is been used with typical children, it's been used with ELL, it's been used with RTI, it's been used with gifted children. Wherever people find a need to develop these kinds of skills with their students, brainware has been effective.
So I think we just want to finish by giving a big thanks to Peggy and Anna for joining us today and taking time away from the second day of summer school, which has just got to be excruciating. So, and thank you to all of you for participating today. It's been fun for us. This is a topic we love to talk about, and hopefully it's been helpful to you. If you have further questions, we're happy to address them. And again, we'll advise you when the recording has been posted, and you'll be shortly, hopefully the next day or two, seeing a copy of the slides. So thank you again, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Bye all.
Thank you. Bye.